The badge reader blinked red. Once, twice, then buzzed low like it was tired of seeing me. I didn't try again. I simply placed my palm on the cool glass of the lobby door and waited. A younger receptionist, one I hadn't seen before, looked up nervously. No name badge. No good morning, Miss Kale. Just silence. Realignment meeting, I said softly. She nodded too quickly, typing nothing into her keyboard. I took the elevator alone. Floor 4, hallway 6, last door on the left. The conference room no one ever used unless someone was being pushed out quietly. The glass walls offered no privacy. It was like being fired inside an aquarium. Dale Vernette, the CEO, was already late. When he finally walked in, blue tie, crooked coffee in hand, he didn't apologize. He didn't look at me either. He simply opened a slim black folder and started reading. Meridia, thank you for joining us. As part of Corvax's strategic realignment and initiative toward lean automation, we've reassessed roles associated with legacy systems integration and concluded that a forward reallocation of resource bandwidth is optimal to meet evolving KPIs. I had written scripts like that once. Dale used to ask me to decode HR buzzwords so junior staff wouldn't panic. Now here he was, using them on me like they were truth. Next to him sat Vernon Kleiss, director of HR. His mouth was drawn into a thin, artificial line like someone had ordered him not to speak. He didn't. Across from me, a man barely out of his 20s flipped through a sleek tablet. Elian Cross. I'd heard whispers, a process intelligence expert with a background in AI automation hired directly from a consulting firm. His hands moved confidently, but he never once looked up. He was already replacing me. They just hadn't said it yet. A white folder slid across the table. Severance, standard, generic. Dale finally glanced at me. We appreciate your contribution, Meridia. Contribution? As if I donated a used printer. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't speak. I stood not with hesitation, but deliberately slow, letting the air stretch and tighten. My eyes drifted to the corner of the room where I once briefed the executive team on a power grid misroute that could have frozen shipments across the West Coast. No one mentioned that today. No one even looked. I walked out without a word past the badge reader that had stopped recognizing me. The air outside was brittle, with January frost. I didn't shiver. I'd felt this coming for weeks, and I had already started packing the day before. The day before they fired me, I emptied my drawer with the same care I used when mapping emergency reroutes during winter gridlocks. Quiet. Clean. No trace. The mug with the cracked handle went into my tote bag. So did the handwritten notes pinned under the desk mat vendor. Quirks, internal escalation preferences, the kind of things no system ever logs. I deleted everything else. Personal files, drafted memos, unsent warnings. I moved my private network logs to a flash drive and scrubbed the copy paths from the machine. It took less than 10 minutes. I'd rehearsed it in my head a dozen times since the first skipped planning call. They had stopped inviting me to architecture sprints. Then came the emails I was BCC'd on instead of directly addressed. A phrase began circulating post-legacy visioning, one I hadn't written. In the break room, I overheard two junior analysts whisper about the new system's kickoff meeting. One of them mentioned a pilot team Elian was leading. My name never came up. They noticed me and stopped talking, suddenly interested in a coffee machine neither had touched. I smiled politely and left. It was fine. I wasn't surprised. The shift always came before the fall language changed first, then posture, then silence. And I'd seen this sequence before in other companies with other women just a few years older than the new standard. I didn't attend the afternoon check-in with Dale. It was still on my calendar, but I already knew he wouldn't show. I watched the dot beside his name go dark right as the clock turned 2:30. That evening, I sat in my car for a long while after pulling into the garage. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. I thought about the West Corridor contract I'd once salvaged with a late-night workaround no one ever documented. I thought about the vendor in Oregon who still faxed me reports because I was the only one who ever called him directly. I didn't feel rage or fear or loss. What I felt was more focused, more pointed. They thought I was a relic of intuition, impossible to scale, easy to erase. But I'd seen this pattern before, and this time I'd mapped the gap before it opened. They never wrote my name into the disaster playbooks, but I was there every time the trucks halted 2 miles from the rail yard in a surprise whiteout. Every time the Midwest froze harder than forecasts predicted, I rerouted freight through a chain of side hubs no one bothered to map, because I knew which terminals had skeleton crews willing to work extra shifts for coffee and respect. They called it luck when the penalties didn't come. They called it coincidence when compliance officers left audits early smiling. They didn't know I flagged the risk 3 days before it tripped a system alert. I watched tone changes in emails, vendor silence, shift pattern disruptions. I noticed when someone answered at 5:04 a.m. instead of 6:12. I noticed when an invoice came in at 80 DPI instead of 300. That wasn't instinct. That was memory. 28 years of memorizing the tempo no software tracked. I once adjusted a quarter's logistics cycle because one of our rural suppliers started using fewer exclamation marks in their order confirmations. No one asked why I intervened. No one saw the price jump that didn't happen. They just nodded when the margin held. When junior analysts asked about the Kale method, I tried to explain that there wasn't one. There were just people, pressure and patterns. They always wanted flowcharts. I had rhythms, but they didn't want rhythms anymore. They wanted predictability dressed up in polished interfaces. They wanted a system that didn't require feeling. I tried once to document my work. I drafted a transition manual after the first acquisition wave. Pages of contextual nuances, soft alerts, escalation flow, pivots by region and season. Dale skimmed it in 5 minutes and called it unscalable. So I stopped trying. No one ever asked again. By the time they pushed me out, the archives held nothing with my name. No patents, no trademarks, no workflows traced to me. To them, I was a relic, a holdover from a time when memory mattered more than dashboards. But I knew better. They didn't fire a coordinator. They erased the one person who remembered how to keep the rhythm from cracking. And 37 vendors were already starting to fall out of step. By the morning of the second day, the cracks were no longer invisible. The vendor portal showed 37 flagged accounts in red status, unresponsive. Several hadn't confirmed shipment. Others failed to acknowledge new compliance protocols embedded into the rollout plan. I wasn't logged into Corvax's system anymore, of course, but I still had access to public supplier dashboards, the places no one looked unless they were tracking soft patterns, not polished metrics. The auto-scheduler skipped adjustments for 2 regional holidays, including the Republic Foundry closure in Nebraska, a plant I'd personally onboarded in 2009 after 3 failed attempts by outside consultants. The shipment didn't arrive. The penalty clause in that contract triggered automatically $4.8 million. They didn't even see it coming. Somewhere inside the Corvax building, I imagined Dale Vernette gripping a conference phone, his voice rising an octave too high, demanding answers in a room full of silence. Elian Cross would be standing stiff, sweatless, insisting the issue lay in legacy processes that weren't fully transitioned. He wouldn't realize that the transitions never worked because no one asked how they'd worked in the first place. And Vernon from HR, if he was even allowed to speak, would quietly suggest bringing in a third-party stabilizer. He used to recommend yoga retreats when things got tense. Meanwhile, investors were circling. Not the ones who read board memos, the ones who noticed when shipping delays made news feeds and penalties became line items. I didn't read headlines. I read signals. And the signals were clear. Inbox 1 new message. Subject perception-based forecast systems. Invitation to collaborate. Sender Lyra Nevado. Short. Unassuming. I remember what you said at the Nashville Summit. We're building something built on memory, not just metrics. You still designing the things no one sees. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking under her signature. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to, because something was already moving underneath the surface, something they didn't see, something I'd been preparing for far longer than they understood. I hadn't thought about Lyra Nevado in years. We'd met briefly at a logistics summit in Nashville, the kind of event filled with jargon-laced keynotes and booths that promised disruption but sold redundancy. She was different. Young, sharp, but quiet, she didn't network to be seen. She watched. We'd talked for 15 minutes over burnt hotel coffee. She asked questions no one else did about rhythm patterns in vendor behavior, about instinctive triggers that precede failure. I remember saying something like, "It's not always about what's missing. It's about what stops feeling right." Now here she was, a message blinking in my inbox. "We're designing a memory-driven system. Are you still building things no one sees?" I didn't reply. Not because I wasn't interested, because I wasn't ready. I had spent almost 3 decades giving too much to people who only heard what suited them. I wasn't sure I had the energy to explain again. 2 days passed. Then a second message arrived. "I don't need your resume. I need your instinct. No pleasantries, no vague compliments, just precision." That was the moment something in me shifted, not out of ambition, but alignment. She understood the currency I dealt in quiet foresight, context, pattern literacy, the things no executive ever added to a budget line. I wrote back, "Send a location." The reply came less than an hour later, an address downtown, a time no fluff. I sat with the message for a while before closing my laptop. No part of me wanted to rebuild what I'd left, but something about the way she worded it, memory-driven, felt like an open door to a different kind of structure, one that didn't erase people like me, but started with them. The next morning, I left my house without a laptop, just a notebook and pen. I didn't need data sets. I carried the system in my bones. I was done fighting to be heard by people who only valued noise. This time, I was walking into a room that was already quiet. The office wasn't what I expected. No branded walls or espresso taps, just a long table, mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard stained with half-erased ideas. The only sound was the low hum of thought. It was exactly right. Lyra introduced me to the team, a lean mix of engineers, behavioral analysts, and a former disaster relief coordinator named Juno, who wore noise-canceling headphones and noticed everything. No one asked for a resume. No one asked what went wrong at Corvax. They asked what I saw when systems failed in silence. We called it Perceptra. Not a dashboard, not an AI clone, a memory engine. It didn't track numbers, it listened to signals beneath them. Slack message tone, timing gaps between routine check-ins, subtle shifts in vendor response syntax, the delay between a file upload and an access request. The weight of quiet. I mapped the failure curves from memory, the moments I used to feel in my chest before a system crashed or a vendor pulled out. We trained the platform to recognize those fractures not after they happened, but before. Perceptra didn't scream. It pulsed. Soft flags, early cues, prompts like, "Check here." Something's off. The team didn't flinch when I suggested things like emotional lag thresholds or behavioral drift indexing. They didn't push back when I described how I used to know when a supplier's lead would underperform just by how he signed an email. They leaned in, took notes. For the first time, I wasn't whispering warnings into a void. I was designing the shape of the warning itself. We built audit prep dashboards that adjusted to seasonal staff turnover, vendor scoring models that accounted for personal crisis frequency by region, even contract templates that embedded reminders like, "This clause broke during Q1 stress test last year." I wasn't trying to replicate Corvax's systems. I was building the one they never deserved. And just as we hit our first working prototype, a message came through the contact portal. The domain read corvaxintegrity.com. It came in late on a Tuesday. No subject line, just an anonymous submission through our demo request form. U3 deployment needed. Proactive vendor forecast module. Urgent. I almost didn't open it, but the domain caught my eye, corvaxintegrity.com. There was no sender name, no department listed, just urgency cloaked in vagueness, the kind that smells like panic. Lyra glanced at me after reading it but said nothing. She knew better than to ask if I wanted to lead the call. I didn't. 3 days later, she hosted the demo from our side of the video wall. I sat off-camera headset on a notepad in my lap I never wrote on. The faces that joined the call were obscured by initials project leads, hiding behind burner accounts or junior staffers tasked with finding miracles. They asked for functionality summaries, integration speeds, case studies. Lyra gave them everything, clear, measured, efficient. She never oversold, never filled silence with fluff. Toward the end, someone unmuted. Just curious what inspired the design behind Perceptra, Lyra didn't even glance at me. It was built by someone who translated pressure into rhythm and never got thanked for it. Silence followed, a beat longer than normal, then a nod. Another muted square blinked green, then off again. They didn't know. Not yet. But the system they were desperate to license was born from the very silence they'd tried to erase. Well, after the call, Lyra didn't ask how I felt. She just handed me the closed laptop like a passing of something weightless, but known. They were already running reports against our demo data. I could see the access logs update in real time. The same company that once told me my insights were too difficult to operationalize now measuring their survival against a platform crafted from my discarded intuition. It didn't sting. Not anymore. I only watched. Because the contract was coming. I could feel it before it was signed. The contract came in under a generic procurement initiative, buried in a cluster of strategic vendor rollouts signed off during what I imagine was a last-minute crisis control session. There was no signature line with Dale's name, no acknowledgement of who authored the system now wired into their daily operations. Just numbers, just need. Perceptra was now licensed to Corvax at $200 annually, with optional expansion into supplier integrity and audit resilience modules. Optional. They would choose both by the end of the quarter. Weeks later, someone forwarded me a clip from an internal keynote Dale had delivered, one of those polished executive addresses meant to calm shareholders and reframe desperation as innovation. He stood confidently in front of a branded slide titled Operational Foresight, the New Standard. And then he said it. We've reinvented risk by translating human nuance into predictive signals. I didn't flinch, but I had written those words. Not figuratively, literally. They came from a memo I submitted 3 years ago after a late winter supply chain freeze, one that would have cost the company $9 million had I not rerouted half the Western corridor through emergency contracts signed by flashlight during a power outage. The memo had gone unread. No reply, no comment, just silence. Now it was a headline in Dale's keynote, a revelation. No one clapped in the clip. Just a quiet murmur of approval, the kind that follows any phrase delivered with confidence, and a branded backdrop. I didn't send a correction. I didn't need to. Because every morning now, their system pings quietly at 6:05 a.m., the hour I used to begin my rounds noting overnight anomalies, vendor delays, shifts in rhythm. They think it's just a feature, but it was muscle memory coded into software. They run on what I carried. And soon they'd start noticing improvements they couldn't explain, metrics they'd never tracked smoothing out before impact. They wouldn't understand why, but I would. Every Monday at 6:05 a.m., my inbox lights up with a quiet pulse. No fanfare, no blinking red alerts, just subtle markers written in the language only I ever spoke fluently. Vendor trust dip, Midwest corridor, contract drift, Palladino audit threshold, behavioral lag Q1 onboarding cluster. I don't respond. I don't need to. The system adjusts itself now, flagging, recalibrating, nudging. Just as I used to do when I walked the floor before sunrise, noting the small signs no one else bothered to see. A half-finished report. A vendor check-in that arrived 4 minutes later than usual. A missed call that didn't trigger panic, just a feeling. Perceptra learned all that from me. Not because I taught it with flowcharts, but because I fed it the rhythm I carried for years. Now it listens where others still look. Corvax doesn't know who maintains the behavioral layer. The code is attributed to a shell repository owned by Lyra's firm. As far as they're concerned, it's just another smart plugin with a clean UI, something they bought, something they own. But I know different. When a plant delay is averted before anyone above regional management even hears a whisper, when a supplier shifts terms early to avoid a compliance breach, when an engineer in Baton Rouge adjusts a delivery window without needing an explanation. That's me. Or rather, that's the memory I embedded into the machine, the one they tried to delete. They think they're running Perceptra, but really they're running on ghosted instinct reflexes I honed in silence for nearly 3 decades. They never asked who wrote the code. They never questioned how it knew things before the data did. But every week, as the logs flow in and the system performs its quiet rituals, I sit with my coffee and watch. They erased me. But now they move to a rhythm they didn't create. And I'm still the only one who knows how it breathes. Corvax never reached out. No email, no LinkedIn message, no quiet apology buried beneath a formal memo. Just silence, the kind they once assumed meant compliance. They host webinars now. Thought leadership in predictive risk, the human-centric turn in data. Dale speaks confidently, gesturing toward charts built on code they don't understand. Sometimes he quotes lines I wrote in memos they never answered. They echo now like original thought packaged for press kits and investor calls. I don't correct him. I don't attend. I log in. I read the weekly flows. I make small adjustments where the system drifts. Nothing drastic, just realignments. A delivery timing curve that needs nudging. A vendor priority flag that reads too cold. I change one line of logic and close the dashboard. That's enough. They don't know I'm still there. Not as an employee, not as a name. But every stabilized metric they celebrate every quarter without a breach. Every vendor who quietly stays instead of walking. That's not coincidence. That's continuity they didn't earn, maintained by someone they chose to forget. I was never trying to be remembered. I was trying to build something that outlasted the room I was pushed out of. And I did. They replaced my name, scrubbed my profile, told themselves I was a relic of a slower era, but their dashboards hum because I understood when and why things broke, not just how. They thought silence meant absence, but it became the most expensive thing they ever relied on. Now I move through my days differently. I take walks in the morning, I read more, I sleep. I listen to music that doesn't remind me of freight corridors or quarterly projections. I don't miss Corvax. Because every time they run a risk forecast or celebrate a clean audit, they're moving to a rhythm they didn't invent. And every Monday at 6:05 a.m., that rhythm still starts with me.